Hi, everybody. Welcome to the TERMIS SYS Europe Interviews with a Scientist. With these interviews, we want to briefly portray the variety of profiles of young scientists in the TERMIS community. Today, we have Vanessa LaPointe. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
So first, we want for you to introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me today. My name is Vanessa LaPointe. I'm an associate professor at Maastricht University. That's my job title, at least. As a person, I'm Canadian originally, and after a long journey through a number of countries, through the US, through the UK, I've been living in the Netherlands now since the end of 2012.
Thank you. And can you tell us what your research is about? What do you work on these days at Maastricht?
Yeah, so my group works in the field of regenerative medicine, which I think is not a field I need to explain to any of you. What we do is we're really fundamentally interested in how to control cell behavior for regenerative medicine applications. I think many people, of course, in regenerative medicine could say this about their groups, but what we're trying to do is to really learn more about how cells work. I would describe the group as tissue agnostic, which is a nice term that just simply means that we're very happy to work on basically all parts of the body from head to toe. And what we specialize in is studying three-dimensional cultures, so aggregates of cells or complex, more kind of mini organs, organoids as well, and obtaining high quality, especially single cell level information from them. And all the questions that we're asking, which is largely hypothesis-driven research, is aiming to make regenerative medicine more successful.
That sounds really, really exciting. So in a more hands-on or more practical terms of things. So how do you manage your group? Do you usually have weekly meetings or every 2 weeks? And are you a cool new PI that uses interesting tools, or are you a bit of an old school? So do you use Slack or Trello, OneNote, or that kind of stuff to communicate with your team members?
I'm not sure anyone would call me a cool PI, but I like the the insinuation there. No, so the group is run I guess in a kind of a layered structure. So we do have weekly group meetings. In these meetings, we typically have 1 to 2 speakers, and the idea is that they're really discussing their data. So it's not a conference presentation where you're trying to tell a very tight story. It's what is working, what is not working. It should be very open discussion like that. I have to say that since we've switched to Zoom, it's become much less of a dynamic discussion. And that's just one of the many side effects of the pandemic. But I hope we can recover from that. We also do in that context a journal club about monthly. And we're trying a new format for the journal club, which is to do more of a highlights from the literature. So instead of always doing the very traditional figure by figure kind of analysis and sometimes tear down as well of maybe a paper, we're trying to also come back with 5 interesting studies that you've read recently that you think the group would be interested in knowing, and making it a little bit more lighthearted like that. As to the tools that I'm using in the group, yeah, quite varied. I would not say that I'm a very modern PI in that sense. It actually drives me kind of crazy to have 10 different apps on my phone, all of which are inlets for people to ask me questions, because I'm a very ordered person and I just lose track. It's too much, but I do a little bit. So we've been on Evernote for ages. The whole institute is actually using OneNote as an electronic lab notebook now, so I'm also really supporting that. I personally use Trello to mix success, but at least to keep track of the pipeline of papers. So for manuscripts, I find that very helpful. And yeah, otherwise though, we're not on Slack. We kind of tried to get it off the ground, but the activity levels were not high enough to sustain it, so that fell to the side. Yeah, and other than that, basically my way of running the group is to talk to people individually. So I make sure I sit with everyone in my group, normally weekly, sometimes it's bi-weekly, if they're, maybe a more senior postdoc, and actually give them one-on-one attention. So in those meetings, we're also discussing data, in our group meeting, but also by meeting weekly, we can cover more things. So maybe we also talk about professional development, personal situations, tips on how to write more effectively, which I spend a lot of time talking to people about. And we try to kind of do all that on more of a one-to-one basis.
Thanks, Vanessa. You can definitely be classified as a cool young PI with the Trello and sometimes Evernote. So that's definitely it. And we wanted to ask you, how did the pandemic affect your research? If you can tell us also, how did you affect yourself, your way of being and working as a PI? And can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I mean, how the pandemic affected my research and me as a person, like, is, I think, not even yet known. I think it will be some time to see how we all come out of this and how things have changed. So, but it's definitely been like direct and indirect. So, I mean, directly on the research, very simply, our institute has reduced lab access. Our personnel have been working on lab shifts. So it's not that they can just go in and do what they want anymore. And it's just not the case that people can do the same amount of work in fewer hours. There's this kind of like ideal that maybe we could all optimize ourselves and be more efficient, but I don't recognize that. What I see is that people are under a lot of pressure. They're trying to perform at the same level, but by and large, it's not possible. Indirectly also related to the research, like definitely I've seen effects on collaborations. That's quite mixed. Like some collaborations maybe were even easier to get off the ground because you don't have to try to find time together. Like it suddenly becomes okay to not be able to travel. I have young children at home, so maybe I wouldn't have been able to collaborate with someone if the expectation was that I got on a plane to have a first introduction, but now it's like, oh, sorry, we have to be on Zoom anyway. So you can hide that a little bit almost. But also some things are definitely slipping through the cracks. Like there are a number of consortium projects that I'm a part of where really, very focused attention is needed. And it's very hard to get everyone aligned and on the same page. And that's also having an effect on our research for sure. What that effect will actually look like in terms of publications, grants, stuff like that, some years down the road, I really don't know. And I can't even begin to predict. Also personally, I mean, of course, it's had an enormous effect on me as it has on everyone. And like, I wouldn't even also want to start to compare myself to others. I'm definitely not operating at the same level that I was. I tried very hard to, and there's this kind of like act that you do, right? To keep all the balls in the air, juggling and putting in the extra hours to make sure that things are done and that you try to kind of keep things going as smoothly as possible for everyone else. I think that's a big part of the job of being a PI, but I'm not succeeding totally. There's no way. I had my children at home during the lockdown, and like these are 2 children under the age of 2. To work with that is, I mean, it's a joke. It's impossible. So yeah, so things got dropped, and the quality of my work is not where I'd like it to be. I definitely spend more time in a more like superficial feedback, trying to keep things moving through the pipeline.
Yeah, I can't begin to imagine if it's difficult to concentrate when you live on your own, to live with 2 little kids running around. It doesn't make it easier. So how big is your lab in terms of students, postdocs, and if you would you rather keep it small or go big? How do you find yourself that you're the most, the best as a PI in terms of lab size?
Yeah, that's actually something I've thought a lot about when starting the group. But of course, it's not that you get to like choose the size of your group. We're all dependent on raising competitive funding. So yeah, I mean, I guess you can choose to keep it small. You can stop writing grants, but then you also have to be careful because you can also have a gap, right? Where maybe you have a bad year or 2 in fundraising and then your small group becomes no group. So it's hard to engineer. But as to what I think is best, when I began, I also kind of had the feeling of like the kind of 10 to 15 range was an ideal number, and I haven't changed my mind from that. I think that that's a size where you can have like a kind of good balance of diversity, and diversity, I mean like literal in the sense of diversity of the people, but also multidisciplinarity and different projects and different collaborations. But then you can also maintain some cohesion, and as a supervisor, 10 to 15 people is still a reasonable number that you can see regularly. When it gets beyond that, I mean, the math doesn't work out, right? You can't spend an hour with 40 people in your group, or that's all you're going to do in the week. So I like that. My group right now is around that size. So of course I'm also biased because I think it's working well. But it's also like, I think what's really a strength is that we've maintained a decent ratio. Like sometimes actually it's even 50-50 between PhD candidates and postdocs. And I think that's a really nice, like, really nice for the PhD candidates for sure to have these experienced people around them, but also as a supervisor, I really enjoy that because you have like people at different stages and also like with different backgrounds, and they're really contributing knowledge to the group then. And then of course we always have some students around, so undergraduate students, bachelors and masters, typically kind of 3 or so students at any given time.
Thank you. And can you tell us about your PhD? What did you do your PhD on, what, and as well the postdoc? Tell us about your research, your academic career, and how was your transition from postdoc to PI?
Yeah, okay, I'll try to walk you through the story. So I did my PhD in London at Imperial College under the supervision of Molly Stevens, and which is a very large group as well, so in relation to the contrast. Yeah, so my PhD was on how stem cells respond to substrates, so to materials, basically. I had come into my PhD with actually an engineering background. I studied as a biomedical engineer, but I'd taken a year off and done embryonic stem cell research in that time. So my PhD also was kind of nicely aligned with my background in a way. I had this kind of concentration material science as an engineer, and then also stem cell research in this year off that I took, and then was able to do both. And yeah, in my PhD, we did some kind of very nice early studies actually in how stem cells respond to things like substrate elasticity, microtopographies, nanotopographies. I also started working on like cell matrix interactions with integrin biology and stuff like that. That year off that I mentioned was really like a seminal year in my career. First of all, it was because I had to pay tuition and have my own living expenses during my PhD. So I had to make some money, and that's, I think, very different than the typical, at least the typical Dutch setting where we are now. But it also very much shaped my like approach to my career. So it actually turned out to be a very good year off because I was able to transition from being an engineer into more interdisciplinary with the stem cell background. So for my postdoc, well, actually, I never really did a proper postdoc, which is very unusual. But I began at the University of Twente with plans to do was actually only a 1-year postdoc. It was a bit of a transition period as well. I didn't necessarily expect to stay, but still in the Netherlands all these years later. So obviously we know how that worked out. And I started writing grants as a postdoc. So that was almost a full-time job. So in that 1 year, I hardly actually did any of my own research. I was really writing grants to actually secure also longer-term funding and a future. And then maybe about 3/4 of the way through that year or so, our institute at the University of Twente decided to move to Maastricht University to start what is now my current institute, so the MERLN Institute here. And I kind of fell into a bit accidentally, or just, it just worked out like this, that I started being a bit of a project manager for that move. So I started designing our laboratory facilities, figuring out all the purchasing we were going to do because we had to buy everything new, also dealing with a lot of the structural issues of moving an institute and starting a new institute, in fact. So the topic of my postdoctoral research was basically like lab construction. Really, not necessarily something I would recommend, to be fair. Of course, I did really learn a lot from it, but it was not the best training, right, as far as like the scientific training that I got. And in that period, I was offered a tenure track position. So I kind of glossed over the postdoctoral period. I also never did a master's, so I have a kind of strange career of skipping over some degree stages, but I guess it worked out in the end. So now I'm a PI and nicely situated.
I guess they wouldn't have offered you the tenure track if they hadn't seen potential, or you weren't. Sometimes you have to be in the right place at the right time, but also having the skills behind you. I don't think that's only a matter of luck. And then how do you disseminate your research? So the research that is being done in the lab, either at the earlier stages or when stories are properly finished. Well, I guess like we all do publications and things like this, but a bit maybe for the general public, do you do any special activities? Do you use Twitter lots? Things like this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like scientific publications remain like the main, formal outlet for our research, like everyone. And we do really make like a concerted effort to publish open access and stuff like this. So like that's fine, but I'm not special there. I'm like 10 years behind on using social media in science. So I'm like not active on Twitter. It's like literally an item on my to-do list to pick this up and get better at it. And it's been on my to-do list for a number of years. So I'm not going to promise that it's anytime soon. We try to be active in like outreach. So whenever there's like opportunities to talk about our science, like I really actually enjoy explaining complex scientific concepts in a way that is accessible to people. So I really do try to participate in those things and also encourage people in the group to do the same. In our current environment, of course, there's a language barrier because I can't go to a primary school of Dutch speaking children and explain to them, but I do try to get involved. And now we're starting a company, which I guess is also a form of dissemination, but maybe not exactly what you were referring to as far as like public dissemination, but we are spinning off technology actually into a company, which will be bringing that hopefully to patients in the near future.
Thanks. And we would like to ask you about, so you were mentioning that you wrote your first grant fellowship around the time of your first postdoc, which was not real, as you said, a real postdoc, but can you tell us about your first grant, if you remember about this? And it's also tell us about the funding body. Was it difficult? Tell us about your experience. Think about someone of his or her first postdoc that is listening to us. What would you say to him, her?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, it was super difficult. Like, it was frustrating and demoralizing, and there were definitely tears shed on, when the 10th rejection letter came along, which it did. So actually my first fellowships were actually in my PhD, but those were a bit different. That's like more like studentships. My first real grant, so like one that was, went through a competitive peer review process, like that was indeed during my postdoc. I think I wrote like 12 to 15 grants in that year. I got 2, which is not an amazing success rate, but it's better than 0, and I was happy with it. As for the topic, first of all, so the funding bodies, my funding first came from the AO Foundation, which is Orthopedics Foundation, is a startup grant, and a postdoctoral fellowship from the CIHR, which is a Canadian Health Research Institute. So 2 very different types of grants as well. Like the AO grant was really for the scientific project, and the CIHR fellowship was more for me individually. And they both actually came kind of close together after many failures. So yeah, for advice, I think so it is a numbers game. I mean, obviously applying to more things gives you a better chance, but when there's a 10% success rate, it's not that applying to 10 grants gets you 1, right? That's unfortunately not how the math works. What I did, which had advantages and disadvantages, was I definitely applied for things that I really didn't have any business applying for. I wrote applications for things that I just wasn't the right person for it, or I didn't have the right background, or I didn't have the right project to fit. And on one hand, you learn from that because every time you write your work, it gets a little bit sharper, but also I wasted a lot of time. So I think that I would have really benefited from a little bit of trimming of my ambition, actually, because I came with this whole long list of things to apply for, and a little bit more strategy of being like, yeah, look, you're never going to get that fellowship. Like, it's completely different type of scientists they're looking for. That could have also saved me some pain. But that being said, it was still useful. Like, I mean, in my daily work, writing grants is the prerequisite to everything that follows. You will have no papers unless you can hire a person to go to the lab for which you need to have obtained a grant. So working on grant writing skills as a postdoc, I think is like an extremely useful, important thing to do. And now I also try to support other postdocs doing it because like I still feel the pain. Like I really remember how hard it was, and yeah, how much like I would have also benefited from more people around me doing the same.
Yeah, on that note, do you have to write all of this on your own, or were you like helping a bigger grant and you just writing a little piece? Or because it seems like when you have a bit of experience writing a paper, for example, you know what you're doing and you're talking about something that you're actually done. And this is talking about something about the future. And sometimes it's hard if you really need to put all the exact experiments that you're willing to do, or just of a bigger picture, and if you had like real mentoring there, or like actually supervision on that.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, grant writing is its own language and its own style of writing. Like being able to write well and being able to write a good paper does not necessarily mean that you can write a convincing grant. Maybe even the more technically adept you are, sometimes the harder it is to write a grant that like tells a story and grabs people. So for that, like related to your question about mentoring, I mean, mentoring is extremely important to get that tone right and that style. And like, it comes kind of more naturally now, but it didn't necessarily in the beginning. Yeah, I was supervised throughout this period, of course. I mean, I had my postdoctoral supervisor who was also really like coaching me on this and reading my work and providing feedback and stuff. But, you know, you can see also that was not a guarantee of success. I mean, I also got rejected 10 times, even with experienced people reading my grants and commenting on them. So that's of course to be expected because I mean, I still fail very often in competitive funding. But it also says like, yeah, mentorship is important, but it's also no guarantee. So yeah, I definitely learned a lot in this period. Like now I have these skills and I feel quite comfortable doing it, but this took some years for sure. And I'm still learning and still getting better at it.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing this. I'm sure lots of people will find it helpful. I want to switch gear a bit and ask you about your, well, other than academia, first of all, how do you manage your free time outside academia? And what are your working hours? I know these days it's pretty crazy, but just if you can give us a hint about this.
Yeah, well, I've solved the problem of having to manage free time by just simply not having any. So that was what we would call an elegant solution to the problem. It's right now, like, I mean, I'm almost hesitant to say what my working hours are because I really don't want to give the impression to people that this is how you have to work in academia, but I'll say them anyway and just put a big asterisk on it, which is like, this is not necessarily normal. I begin my working day at 7:45, typically Monday to Friday. Our daycare opens at 7:30, so we're usually home at about 7:45, and that's when the laptop opens with a coffee. And my Zoom meetings typically start at 8 and run more or less the whole day. So I pretty much have scheduled time for the whole working day. I stop at 5 very strictly because again of the daycare pickup. So we swing by daycare, grab the 2 children, and then do the most chaotic, like dinner, stories, bedtime, bath routine. Like it's a complete chaos in the house for 2 hours. The children are typically down by 7, and then I open my laptop again. So, and then I work, yeah, it depends a little bit on what's going on and also how I'm feeling, of course, because sometimes also I'm tired after these days, but I typically also work from about 7 till 9 or 7 till 10, and then I go to sleep. This is not like the kind of great life balance that I would recommend to people. It's also not my own ambition to continue to work like this forever. But right now, I really feel that it has to be this way. So that's what I'm doing. On the weekends, there's a different routine because we have the children home, but I also normally do a couple of hours of work while they're napping during the day, and then again, a couple of hours in the evening. So maybe it's like 4 hours a day or something on the weekends. And this is how I'm trying to keep it together. I've been doing it for now for, yeah, well, pre-pandemic as well. And yeah, it probably won't last forever, but right now this is how it is.
And you were saying before about the different countries that you've lived in. So how many times did you have to move from country to country? And do you think that this is your final country that you're going to be living? Or are you thinking about going back home? And yeah, do you think it's an absolute necessary to move so much? Or do you think there's possibilities to do it without changing countries?
Yeah, really, like, I think this thing about mobility has been like very strongly encouraged or even insisted upon actually by the grant agencies, by the funding agencies, right? Like, there are so many fellowships for which you have to have been mobile. I definitely see the advantages of that. I mean, there's no question that like going to different countries and stuff like brings you new networks, new experiences, but it also takes a huge personal toll. And this has to be acknowledged. And maybe also we should stop forcing people to uproot their lives and move. So for me personally, like, yeah, I'm Canadian originally. I moved to the United States when I was 18 for my undergraduate. I moved back to Canada briefly, then I moved to London, then I moved to the east of the Netherlands, and then I moved to the south of the Netherlands. I once, for like a kind of background check type reason, I had to write out my addresses. This was many years ago, and I think I had like 30 different addresses that I'd lived at in my life. I was like going on Google Street View, trying to like look up house numbers and stuff like that because I had no overview of this. So like, I've definitely been a person that's moved very often, and yeah, it's taken a toll for sure. So on one hand, I really like, I mean, it's great. Like, you can move to a new country, you meet new people, new cultures. There's a lot to learn from that, but it also means really uprooting your life every time. In my case, it meant shedding all of my personal belongings largely, because when you're moving as a student, it's not like you have a moving allowance to relocate your home. So you're getting rid of all your stuff. You're also saying goodbye to friends. These relationships don't necessarily get maintained at the same level when you go away. Being on a visa has a toll as well. Like, still every time I pass through the airport and I go through customs, I feel a little bit grateful that they let me in. There's just a small part of me that worries that one of these days is going to go wrong. And that's also a bit of like mental energy that goes into it. But yeah, right now, like, I've always said I'll stay as long as the going remains good. So if there continue to be good opportunities and I continue to be happy in my workplace, I'll stay. But also, clearly, I'm a person very comfortable moving. So it's also not that I would rule out a move somewhere else in the future.
Thank you for this. And we probably have the last question if we don't have any more from Julia, but we wanted to ask you, how did you get into science? If you had any role model in the past between your mentors or in general, like someone role model in science more as a broadly speaking term. And if you think, I will add this question, if you think how important you think is to inspire right now these days about science.
Yeah, nice questions. So first, as to who got me into science, I think actually credit is actually owed to my parents, who are the opposite of scientists on one hand. They work in media, they're journalists, but they ask questions for a living, basically. And I think that there was kind of like a questioning mentality that I grew up with at the dinner table, where you were supposed to be able to defend a position, but also challenge a position on basically all topics under the sun. And there's definitely like a kind of scientific thinking that comes from that I recognize now that I did not recognize, of course, when I was a child. But I also have an uncle who played a really key role in kind of getting me from the engineering world into the more like science world. He's a stem cell biologist in Canada. And from when I was like 14 or something, I don't know, maybe even younger, there was a period where my family lived in the same city as his lab. And I used to go after school. My school was like down the road, basically, from the university where he worked. And do like menial labor in his lab, which at that age was quite cool and fancy, but I was like refilling tip boxes and stuff like that for him. And yeah, I mean, there was this kind of like exposure to that environment. And so the lab became like a comfortable setting for me. And then that was also the lab, he'd moved at that point, but that was also the lab that I joined when I took that year in between my undergraduate and my PhD. And then I really went into like a kind of stem cell research boot camp with him in that group. So definitely, like, these are people for sure that have in one way or another like landed me where I am today. Like that kind of like general exposure and stuff, I think, is totally invaluable. yeah, then as to how important it is to be inspiring, I mean, it's never been more important. I think we are all, everyone is struggling so much in their own different ways. We're all so uncertain about the future, and we've seen this like some lovely moments for science in the last couple of years, right? I mean, like, you know, the scientific community got together to make vaccines, and like these things is amazing, but we've also seen some like massive failings of science, and massive failings of like the public's understanding of science. And this is, I see this as both like an opportunity, but also say a threat to like science's relationship with the public. And I think it's something we really need to be addressing, and definitely be able to like tell the stories of science, explain how scientific thinking works, what it means when something is true in science and what it doesn't mean as well. It's never been more important. So I hope that also like we can be coming together for that, helping each other through mentoring, both formal and informal relationships, and come back on the other side of all of this, yeah, better than ever. That would be my goal.
Well, with this positive note, I think we can finish the interview for today. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for your time and for sharing with us your story and some tips and tricks on how to succeed, or at least how to be in academia as a young scientist.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.